But if you're like, now we have to build a big customer service organization or people that are operating in a certain way, or you might say it might be harder. Every geography, it could be every town, every state, they really are different. Welcome to At the Table, the podcast that lives at the intersection of culture, teamwork, leadership, and organizational health. I'm your host, Pat Lencioni, joined by Cody Thompson. How are you doing today, Cody?
Doing great, Pat.
We have a very liberal arts, brain candy conversation, but I think it's really interesting to talk about today. What's the topic?
It's called Party at the DMV.
Right, which is real. It's hard to know what that means. What we're going to talk about today is the meta culture around a company. You know, years ago, well, the DMV part comes in this way. I just moved to Tennessee, and my wife and I go there to get our license and everything else, and they're actually friendly. And we're like, how is that? Wait, what's going on here? And it reminded me that every organization of any kind sits within the culture around it. So it kind of makes sense that the DMV in Tennessee reflects Tennessee culture. And so even here, people say, well, they're not as friendly at the DMV as they are at these other places. But we're like, well, Tennessee is just friendlier in general. So people are expected to be pretty nice. Whereas I know that the DMV in New York City, because I know somebody who just moved from there, and at other places where I've lived, there's no expectation. The meta culture around them doesn't support that. And it reminded me, Cody, of when I first got into business, got out of school. I remember hearing a story about Hewlett Packard. And Hewlett Packard in the old days was one of those companies that was like so good at culture and customer service. And it was one of the great companies in the 70s and 80s. And one of the things that Hewlett Packard said is, when you go into a Hewlett Packard office, it should feel like the culture of the company, not of the country. And I remember somebody said, even in France, they said, if you go to Paris and go to the HP office, it should feel like Hewlett Packard more than France. And I thought, wow, how can you do that? And it's a challenge. And I've never really thought about it, but every leader, every organization of any kind needs to consider the culture, the meta culture around them, and be super intentional about how they exist within that.
Yeah, and I love the conversation because so often we're helping codify or define or even create culture in an organization. And sometimes that happens in a building. But I love the conversation of saying like, hey, that building exists or that company exists in a larger culture. And a lot of what we do is help articulate, hey, in the midst of that larger culture, here are the values that we want to have inside the building, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum, you know? And so I think there's a lot of conversations that we can have around this, even like, what is the implication of that with remote work? Or what does that mean in the context of, you know, co-located offices? So really interesting to explore the macro culture in the midst of company culture.
And even companies that are moving, I think certainly in my lifetime, and I would probably say in American history, we've never seen so many like big companies just pulling up and moving to another place. It's happening. And certainly coming from California, and I just left there, tons of companies have left California. And you can calculate that on the smart side by saying, what's the real estate cost there? What is the the cost of living there? And does this make economic sense? But the question is, will your culture be able to thrive there? Because you're going to be in a different meta culture. And I worked at Oracle literally 35 years ago, and more than that. And so Oracle has a culture. Then they moved to Austin, Texas a few years ago. And now they're moving here to Nashville. And it's just so interesting. I wonder if they've asked themselves, okay, what are the implications for this on policy and on hiring and on how we operate in an environment that's not the same as the last one?
Yeah, and I loved your experience at the DMV, just culturally speaking, because like you're in the Bay Area. Both of us moved from the Bay Area to a different state, and how much of this is the natural sort of macro culture in a county, a state, you know, and even just finding the employees that work there. So it's almost like I think some of the conversation we're having is like, how much upstream do you have to to fight. Like if you're in a macro environment that is a more aligned with the company culture you're trying to create, that's a little bit easier. There's less friction there, as opposed to, can the Sacramento DMV really operate the way that you do in Franklin, Tennessee?
Right. This morning, I took my car in because a rock hit the windshield and shattered it. And so I went to the car dealership, and they're great. And I asked, and I knew I was going to be doing this podcast. And I asked the young lady there, I said, hey, are all the other Audi dealerships in the country, are they this friendly? She goes, I don't know. And I it was a dumb question because like she doesn't survey all of them. But I said, because it's really friendly here. And the people in the waiting room are friendly and everybody seems to be pretty happy. That's not the experience I've had in other places. And I guess when you're a company that's serving customers across a wide geography, you have to actually ask yourself, how are we going to be perceived? And what are we doing to make sure that we're controlling for or intentionally projecting the values we want? And how is that impacted by where we're located?
Yeah, I'm curious what you'd say, Pat, because I remember, I've been at the table for 10 years. You've been around for 28, 29 years. And up until 4 years ago, we were a co-located business. Like we all were in Lafayette, California. We had one singular office. And I remember as we were trying to expand our team, feeling like we had a harder and harder time finding people in our area that fit our values. And so there's a little bit of a tension there where it's like, okay, so if you can't find people in the office, I think it's interesting that a lot of people have gone more remote workforce. So it gives you more opportunity to find people that fit your culture, but it's actually harder to create a culture. So that's kind of an interesting tension.
Yeah. And I will say, like coming out here to Franklin, we're hiring more people here, and it is pretty easy to find people that would, because there's a little bit more balance here. Every culture is different, and if you're a high-tech company, I know, and you're like, so we should move our high-tech company to Omaha. And by the way, Omaha's a great place, but you're not going to find as many engineers and people that just love working on a high-tech startup. But if you're like, now we have to build a big customer service organization or people that are operating in a certain way, or you might say it might be harder. Every geography, it could be every town, every state, they really are different. And I don't think I ever realized that, having grown up in California, where it's such a big state. Okay. And so when Laura and I drove out here, we drove through, 7 different states. And I never noticed, because you're literally doing it like every 4 hours, you're in a different state, or 6 hours. And like we were going through New Mexico. New Mexico's a tough place right now. God bless the people that live there. There's a lot of drugs and crime and financial issues and education and all that. And we'd stop in gas stations there, and it was very sketchy. And then once we left there, we were like 10 miles into Texas, and we pull over at the first gas station, and it's cleaner and friendlier. And I thought, wait, how does that work? How does an entire state have a different, and is it the governor, or is it the history? Is it just this is just one of those fascinating liberal arts things. It's like, why is Texas so different than a neighboring New Mexico? And why is Tennessee different than California? And what does that mean for a leader running an organization in that location?
Well, I'm curious, Pat, like the advice that you would give. So somebody's listening to this and they've listened to dozens of episodes. We often talk about company culture, how important it is to find people that, like, this is the primary thing, is to say, hey, let's define how we behave, right? Question number 2 from the advantage: how do we behave? Who belongs in the company? So they're listening to this and they're like, yeah, this is why you tell us to define our company culture. What advice? So what's the practical advice you'd give to, say, a leader that's saying, hey, we're fighting upstream. We know we clarified our values, or maybe we haven't quite clarified our values. What's the practical application of this macro environment?
Yeah, and I'm not going to make up something like that I know all the answers, but I would say this. If you're establishing a company, ask yourself, have the conversation like, hey, you guys, how does the place where we're located, how does that influence how we do things? And if you're going to move your company someplace, ask yourself, what will be the ramifications on that? And it's not something that you can calculate on a spreadsheet by looking at the cost of living and the real estate cost and all that stuff. There's that, like in accounting, there's goodwill, which nobody quite knows what that is, but accountants even put goodwill on the balance sheet. And so what's the impact on your company of the environment you're in, the city, the state, the neighborhood, whatever else? The second thing I would say is if you're going to establish a new company and you're coming up with your values, ask yourself, can we grow this company here with the employee base and the environment we're in according to those values? And if you're like committed to doing that, just know it's going to be harder in some places than others. And if I were starting something in New York City and I was serving, and this is the other thing, especially if you serve customers outside of your local area, which many businesses do, ask yourself, like, if I were starting a company in New York City and it was all about like high-end service, I don't mean like high-end being, but like really, really helping people and being empathic and friendly and patient, I would have to go, this might be harder to staff this company and manage this company for that than it would be if we were located someplace else. And I think so. My advice is have the conversation, ask yourself if you've really done a good job of understanding that, and go back to that thing. Like, if you wanted to be Hewlett Packard in Paris, what would you have to do to make your company culture rise above the local culture? And that's not a diss on Paris, but I've worked with companies that have offices there, and it's a strong culture there, and it might not be what your company is. So that's what I would say. Have the conversation, be intentional. And then I'd love to hear from people that have experienced this, that can call and say, hey, here's what we found. I have thought that the DMV, just like I thought at the Audi dealership today, I wanted to go up to the manager and say, what are you doing to make it like this? And I just realized that when you talk to people, they're like, what do you mean? And I'm like, so you don't know? And they're like, no, this is just how we are. And it's probably more about the meta environment than it is just about the manager.
Yeah, and it's interesting, even thinking of this as the way that we talk about when you have a clear culture at your company, people are attracted to that who share those same values. Like they end up sort of a tribal sort of community that says, like, I want to work there because it makes me be able to show up more authentically my own self. And I think it's interesting to notice that sort of cultural cohesion in different parts of the like geographic world. And I think that's probably why, as you're driving through the States, people are drawn and want to be authentically themselves. They want to be around people that share values. That's why it's so critical that in companies we actually codify what they are and then project those and reward those and celebrate those with the people that are inside the organization.
You know what's so interesting, Cody, is that you said before, like, we were having a hard time hiring people. And remember, we hired one of our employees and it took us a long time, and we looked and we had all this help from these staffing people and from others. And we found Joel, but he's Joel. He's from Cuba, and he fit our culture. He was fantastic. And he moved to Tennessee. And so even the guy we found there, after searching all over, he's like, yeah, I think I belong. I need to move there. And so, yeah, one of the reasons we left is it's hard to find people, and it's the cost of living. It's the history of the place. There's structural things going on there. And so it's a really interesting thing to think about. There's one last thing I want to say, because it's so when I go to the airports and you deal with TSA. Okay, TSA in many airports feels like the DMV of the skies, right? And then I'll go to an airport sometimes and they're just friendly. And they seem like they're in a good mood and they're helping you they're not going, take your laptop out of your bag. They're like, oh, let me help you with that. And sometimes it makes sense. I'm like, oh yeah, we're in a friendlier place. And sometimes you're in a place where you would think it would be really unfriendly and they defy the odds. And that's where I think, man, there is a manager here that is swimming upstream so well and man, when a company does that, you get rewarded so much in loyal customers, and it's a fabulous thing. So I just want to salute all the managers out there who say, I don't care what the environment is, we're going to create a great culture. And I want everybody else to really stop and ask themselves what the impact of that culture is on what they're doing.
I love it.
All right. There's nothing wrong with a 15-minute podcast. And it's summertime and people don't have a lot of time. So we hope that's helpful to everybody. And we will look forward to talking to you next time on At the Table. God bless.